The purpose of this presentation is to provide a broad overview of the Clean Hydrogen Investment Tax Credit and the associated validation requirements. This session offers guidance on the criteria for assessing the reasonableness of carbon intensity and project designs for clean hydrogen projects. Participation in this information session fulfills CHITC validation information session attendance requirement. An attestation must be completed and included in the validation report for validators and validation reviewers. The attestation template can be found on the CHITC website. During this session, we'll be talking about the legislation, validation concepts, the validation team, independence, pre-validation, planning, execution, and completion of validation. Please note these legal disclaimers. The Income Tax Act and the Carbon Intensity Modeling Guidance document, as well as the Validation and Verification Guidance document, always take precedence over the information in this session. And in case of any discrepancies, the taxpayer should always consult the latest version of those documents when developing their project plans. Let's talk about CHITC legislation and some of the terminology. The purpose of the Clean Hydrogen Investment Tax Credit is to provide a refundable tax credit of up to 40% for the capital cost of eligible clean hydrogen property that is used for production of hydrogen from eligible pathways. There are certain eligibility criteria that we'll be discussing in the following slides. The clean hydrogen ITC rates will be halved in 2034 and fully phased out after that. This ITC also provides a 15% tax credit for the capital cost of clean ammonia property used for production of ammonia from clean hydrogen. Please be aware that the stated tax credit will be contingent on meeting labor requirements, and if these requirements are not met, the tax credit is reduced by 10%. The Income Tax Act sets out the enabling laws for the Clean Hydrogen Investment Tax Credit, which are set out primarily in Section 127.48. Specified percentage is the tax credit rate that is applicable to the capital cost of eligible clean hydrogen property. This tax credit rate evolves with time and is always dependent on carbon intensity. If the carbon intensity of the hydrogen that you're producing is smaller than 0.75 kilogram of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen, you may be eligible for a 40% tax credit. If the carbon intensity is anything between 0.75 and smaller than 2, you may be eligible for a 25% tax credit. For carbon intensities between 2 and smaller than 4, the tax credit is only as much as 15%. And if the hydrogen you produce has a carbon intensity of 4 or greater than 4, you are not eligible for any tax credit. The tax credit will be halved in 2034 and fully phased out after 2034. As I mentioned before, the Clean Hydrogen Investment Tax Credit also offers a 15% tax credit for eligible property that is used to produce clean ammonia from clean hydrogen. Anytime before 2034, this tax credit amounts to 15%. In 2034, this tax credit is halved and equates to 7.5%. and anytime after 2034, the program is fully phased out. Under the Clean Hydrogen Investment Tax Credit, the life cycle carbon intensity of hydrogen is calculated on a cradle-to-gate basis. The denominator of the carbon intensity formula is the aggregate life cycle greenhouse gas emissions from resource extraction or the cradle until the hydrogen is produced and ready to be delivered to another product system or the gate. The denominator is the net amount of hydrogen in kilogram, excluding any hydrogen that is consumed or lost within the hydrogen product system. Expected CI is calculated based on cumulative data that is representative of the first 20 years of operation of the project. Expected CI needs to be validated based on the design of the project. On the other hand, actual CI is calculated annually for the first 5 years of operation and is averaged to determine the average actual CI. Actual CI needs to be verified based on the operation of project. Guidance for calculation of both the expected and actual carbon intensity is provided in the ECCC Carbon Intensity Modeling Guidance document. Here are the main eligibility criteria for a clean hydrogen project. The project must involve operation of eligible clean hydrogen property, production of clean hydrogen through the eligible pathways, or production of clean ammonia. In order for an equipment to be considered an eligible clean hydrogen property, it must have been acquired on or after March 28, 2023, but prior to December 31, 2034, and not been previously used for any other purpose, and definitely be located in Canada. We're going to go through the eligible pathways in an upcoming slide, and also discuss some of the eligibility criteria for projects producing clean ammonia. In order for a clean hydrogen project to become a qualified clean hydrogen project, it needs to produce hydrogen from an eligible pathway. The taxpayer also needs to demonstrate that the expected carbon intensity is calculated in accordance with subsection 6 of the legislation, and that it can reasonably be expected to be achieved based on the project design. For more guidance on the carbon intensity, please refer to the CI modeling guidance. If the project is intended to produce clean ammonia, it needs to be demonstrated that the ammonia facility is dependent on the hydrogen production facility for the supply of clean hydrogen. And if the hydrogen production facility and ammonia production facility are not co-located, the feasibility of transporting hydrogen between the two facilities need to be demonstrated. As of now, there are only two eligible pathways for production of hydrogen. One is electrolysis of water, and the other one is reforming or partial oxidation of eligible hydrocarbons with CO2 being captured using a CCUS process. Let's talk about more eligibility criteria for an electrolysis project. An electrolysis project can supply electricity from the grid, from an eligible power purchase agreement, or by self-generation. There are 6 eligible electricity generation sources under the legislation: wind, solar, hydro, nuclear, geothermal, and tidal. Geothermal and tidal can only be used once a technology-specific carbon intensity is available in the fuel LCA model, and guidance in respect of them is included in the ECCC CI modeling guidance. The eligible sources of electricity for self-generation include those that I just named, as well as generation from on-site equipment that convert hydrogen, eligible hydrocarbons, or recovered heat to electricity. Be aware that if the project is generating electricity burning eligible hydrocarbons, it needs to capture the CO2 emissions. Now let's talk about eligible power purchase agreement. Obviously, it can only be from an eligible electricity generation source, those 6 sources that I just named and are highlighted in the yellow box. There are some temporal restrictions. The electricity generation facility must have started operations after November 3, 2022, and the earlier of the date, that is 2 years before the project plan is filed and 3 years before hydrogen is produced. It has to be also located in the same province as the project and directly connected to the same provincial grid. And if it's in another province, there is provincial grid connectivity between that province and the province that the project is located in. And last but not least, an eligible power purchase agreement must grant the taxpayer the sole and exclusive right to the environmental attributes associated with the electricity. For projects involving reforming or partial oxidation, there are some eligibility criteria regarding the hydrocarbon that is used in the process. A reforming or partial oxidation project can use the natural gas from the pipeline or use methane, ethane, propane, butane, and pentane that is sourced from raw natural gas upstream of gas plants or the off gas from the production of ethylene, as stated in the CI modeling guidance. The project can also opt to use eligible renewable hydrocarbons. Similar to an eligible power purchase agreement, there are some timeline restrictions introduced that seek to add new renewable sources to the overall energy landscape. The eligible renewable hydrocarbon must also be from non-fossil carbon and have a CFR carbon intensity. Last but not least, an eligible renewable hydrocarbon agreement must grant the taxpayer the sole and exclusive right to the environmental attributes associated with the renewable hydrocarbon. And finally, when it comes to sourcing electricity, similar to the electrolysis pathway, the project can use the grid, purchase renewables through a power purchase agreement, or self-generate electricity. In order for a clean hydrogen project that produces ammonia to be an eligible project, the applicant must be able to demonstrate that the clean hydrogen project has sufficient hydrogen production capacity to satisfy the needs of the ammonia facility. That is, 100% of the ammonia must be produced using hydrogen from the clean hydrogen facility. And if the two facilities are not co-located, the applicant must also be able to demonstrate that transporting hydrogen between the two facilities is feasible. Two written justifications may be submitted for projects involving production of clean ammonia. First justification is mandatory, as it outlines the capacity matching between the clean hydrogen and clean ammonia facilities. This includes any rationale for capacity mismatch. Second justification outlines the transportation between the two facilities. This justification is only required if the two facilities are not co-located.
One important concept to understand in validation is the difference between validation and verification. This can be confusing because in common vernacular, validation and verification are used interchangeably. The official definition for validation is a process for evaluating the reasonableness of the assumptions, limitations, and methods that support a statement about the outcome of future activities. The assurance is being provided on the assumptions, limitations, and methods, and in the case of a hydrogen project, the reasonableness of the hydrogen project's performance in the future. Verification, on the other hand, is a process for evaluating a statement of historical data and information to determine if a statement is materially correct and conforms to criteria. Verification is very much about historical data, and it is focused on providing assurance that the CI value is materially correct and has been calculated in accordance with certain criteria. Important concepts to understand is that validation is about looking into the future, and verification is about looking at past data. Validation and verification apply to the clean hydrogen project at different points in time. In the below diagram, you can see a horizontal axis which represents the evolution of a clean hydrogen project. It starts with project feasibility and moves through to commissioning and operation. The yellow box represents pre-operations, and this is where validation can occur, and it can occur at any point in time during that timeline. Validation is based on two pieces of information, the validation information package and the validation report. These are two pieces of information that go together and are submitted to NRCan and CRA. These two pieces of information confirms the project as an eligible clean hydrogen project and whether or not investment tax credits can be issued. Verification occurs during the operation phase, and at year 5 of the compliance period, there is a verification report. The combination of the compliance report and the verification report are submitted to NRCan and CRA. This determines whether or not credits need to be recovered. The compliance period is the period during which the taxpayer's operation activities will be subject to compliance monitoring and verification, and it's also the period in which the average actual carbon intensity will be calculated, which is the value that is used to calculate your carbon investment tax credit. The period is a minimum of 120 days after the day at which the hydrogen is produced. We understand that there are some hydrogen facilities that may have either difficulties in getting into stable operating conditions or may require longer run-up periods to reach those stable operating periods. So there are 2 election periods after the 120 days that a taxpayer can apply for to extend their compliance period start. There are some important relationships to understand in either validation and verification. It is a 3-party relationship where the taxpayer owes an obligation to a second party. In this case, it's the Canadian Revenue Agency and the Natural Resources Canada, in which they have to make an assertion of some sort. In validation, that is the validation information package. In verification, that is the compliance report. The validator or verifier is hired to determine whether the assertion is correct. And the relationship between the validator and verifier and the taxpayer and the second party, the CRA and NRCan, is one of independence. So you can be assured that the validator or verifier is independent of both the taxpayer, CRA, and Natural Resources Canada. There's an interesting relationship between validation and verification. The information provided in the validation information package becomes criteria for the verified compliance report. So the verifier will be using the assumptions, limitations, and models provided in the validation information package as criteria to determine whether the CI value in the compliance period is appropriately calculated. What is validation criteria? Validation criteria are the benchmarks against which the expected CI value and the validation information package are compared. In the case of clean hydrogen projects, that consists of 3 distinct things. The first is the Income Tax Act, specifically Section 127.48. The second is the validation and verification guidance document that's put out by the Clean Hydrogen Investment Tax Credit Group. And the third is the Fuel LCA model, and this is the model that is used to calculate the CI value. It composes of 4 different documents. There is the Carbon Modeling Guidance, there is the Clean Hydrogen Investment Tax Credit Workbook, there are the specifications for Fuel LCA model CI calculations, and there are the data library and fuel pathways that are used to calculate the CI value. These 3 components consist of the validation criteria for the Clean Hydrogen Investment Tax Credit. The validation process can be broken down into 4 distinct phases: pre-engagement, planning, execution, and completion. The validation objective is to have the validator evaluate the reasonableness of the assumptions, limitations, and methods used to assess the characteristics of the clean hydrogen project, which includes whether the clean hydrogen project is recognized as eligible, whether if there's an associated clean ammonia project, whether it is recognized, the reasonableness of the project design, and we'll go into that a little later in the presentation, whether the CI calculation is materially correct and conforms to the criteria, and whether the monitoring plan is structured in a way that it enables future verification. Validation is that process of collecting sufficient and appropriate evidence that allows that validator to come to a conclusion about the validation information package. The validation scope is defined in two different ways. One is geographically, and the third is temporally. In terms of the geographic boundary of the project, we're looking at the life cycle from cradle to gate. The temporal boundaries are for the first 20 years of operation, and that is future operation, not current operation. Validation materiality is the concept that individual misstatements or the aggregation of those misstatements could influence the intended user's decisions. The intended user in this scenario is either Natural Resources Canada or the CRA. Materiality can be broken down into two components: quantitative, which is an error in value or a numerical misstatement, or qualitative, which is the intangible issues that affect the validation information package. In validation, validators are more likely to encounter qualitative rather than quantitative concerns. We have developed a list of questions to aid in assessing qualitative materiality concepts. You can find these questions in Appendix G in the guidance document for validators and verifiers. The following questions are high level, and you can always break them down into a finer detailed level. So for example, question 1, is the project recognized? You could break that down into, does it have an eligible pathway? Eligible hydrocarbon if applicable, if it's eligible ammonia production if applicable, is there an eligible PPA? So you can see how each question can be broken down into finer detail. The other questions that are very broad are, is the validation information package complete and acceptable? Is the project design reasonable? Does the CI value reflect the project design? Does the LCA model correctly reflect the design? Has the CI value been calculated properly? Can it be verified in the future? And has there been adequate disclosure? One of the important concepts in assurance is the hierarchy of evidence. This hierarchy applies whether you're doing validation or verification. On the slide, we have listed in order evidence gathering activities, with observation at the very top of the list being a higher level of evidence, to the bottom of the list, which is inquiry, which is a lower level of evidence. Some of these evidence gathering activities will shift a little bit, but in general, this hierarchy holds true. The evidence gathering activities are the fundamental blocks of evidence gathering for a validation, and they consist of observation, which is typically the observation of activities, examination, which is usually the examination of documents and records, analytical testing, which is mathematical testing between two related variables, confirmation, which is confirming information from another party, recalculation, which involves recalculating values, and query, which is interview evidence. Validation relies on evidence gathering activities, and evidence gathering activities can be combined in a variety of ways to form validation techniques. There are a variety of validation techniques, but in validation, the most common is estimate testing, and this is the assessment of the appropriateness of the estimation methodology, the applicability of the assumptions in the estimate, and the quality of the data used in the estimate. There is a difference between error and uncertainty. In validation, validators are likely to encounter uncertainty, but not so much error. In verification, the inverse is true. Error is the situation where the value can be corrected to a true value, and a true value actually exists. An example would be the meter was misread at 145 tons per minute, and it should have been 151 tons a minute, and you can correct it to the 151 tons a minute. With uncertainty, there is no better value. You've got the true value, but there is a variability around that value. For example, the meter was read at 145 tons per minute, plus or minus 6 tons a minute. So a validator is more likely to encounter uncertainty than error. Uncertainty is usually an issue of disclosure. A qualified validation firm is an engineering firm that is recognized in Canada, has appropriate insurance coverage, has expertise in fuel LCA modeling, and also in the process of hydrogen production for that project that may or may not include ammonia, is independent of and has an arm's length relationship with the taxpayer, and meets any other requirements in the validation and verification guidance document. Qualified validation firms must have appropriate insurance coverage, and this includes being insured against professional liability. This is an example of what insurance coverage may look like for an engineering firm. And although your insurance may not be identical to this, it gives a pretty good example of what might be expected in your geographical region. Qualified validation firms should have a complaints mechanism. This complaints mechanism may vary from firm to firm, but there's some core common features. The first is individuals that conducted the validation that's being complained against should not be involved in the complaints handling process. The confidentiality of all the individuals involved should be maintained. There should be transparent and timely communication between all the parties, that the complaints mechanism addresses all aspects of the validation, including all the team members and the team reviewer, or the validation reviewer, and any formal notice of outcome is issued not only to the complainant, but to Natural Resources Canada. In terms of records maintenance, records must be maintained for a minimum of 15 years. Who you need on your validation team will vary on the subject matter. It is difficult to predict in advance what these team members will look like, but we want you to be aware of the different types of competencies that you may require on the team. You may require someone who is a specialist in the technical processes that you're examining, or the life cycle of the hydrogen, or the process modeling, or perhaps even in the clean hydrogen investment tax credit requirements, or the standard ISO 14064 Part 3, which lays out the process for validation and verification. There may even be a role for a person who is familiar with the clean fuels regulation if a carbon intensity from that regulation is used in the CI value. We do not expect to have a person that has all of these competencies. We expect that the team as a composite will have the necessary competencies to conduct the validation. Validation must be conducted by a qualified validation firm. A qualified validation firm, among other things, must be a professional engineer or an engineering firm. When developing the validation team, the team leader must be employed by the validation firm. However, all other validators on the validation team can be subcontractors or may be employed by the validation firm. When examining the qualifications of the validation team, it's important to have specialties represented on the team. These again may be employees of the validation firm or they may be subcontractors. But the specialties that must be covered are process modeling and life cycle assessment. In some cases, you may need the specialty of the clean fuel regulation represented as well. The other role in the validation is the validation reviewer. The validation reviewer can be a contractor. However, it is best that they are employed by the validation firm since they have to be familiar with the risk tolerance and management of the validation firm. The validation team leader must have some certain certifications, knowledge, and training. In terms of certifications, they must be a professional licensed engineer. In terms of knowledge, they must have an understanding of the validation process, including things like how to design a validation, typical evidence gathering activities, any significant decision points, and interpretations of materiality. A good understanding of the Clean Hydrogen Investment Tax Credit Program is essential. Understanding the validation firm's procedures in terms of risk assessment and issuing assurance. Technical competence in the applicable sector in which they are dealing with in terms of validation. Understanding the validation documentation, including storage requirements, the documentation of misstatements and gaps, the determination of conclusions and their resolutions, and of course sufficient knowledge to manage the team. In terms of training, they should have an ISO 14064 Part 3 Basics course under their belt. They should have this course, which is a basic validation information section produced by NRCan. In the future, there will be annual updates for the Clean Hydrogen Investment Tax Credit for validators. And there should be some training on the fuel LCA model or relevant experience in terms of dealing with life cycles of hydrogen and calculating carbon intensities. In most situations, the validation team will require a life cycle assessment specialist. There are no certifications required for the LCA specialists, but they should have a good understanding of ISO 14040, 44, and Technical Specification 14071, which all have to do with life cycle assessments, whether that be the principles and framework, requirements and guidelines, or the critical review processes and reviewer competencies. The types of knowledge that we're looking for in the LCA specialist are to ensure that they understand the use of the fuel LCA model, the Clean Hydrogen Investment Tax Credit CI modeling guidance, and any current LCA practices. We'd also like them to understand the clean fuel regulations because the fuel LCA model used in the clean fuel regulations is used as a basis for the calculations for the CI value. In that fuel LCA model, there is an LCA data set, and the generation and review they should be familiar with. Any critical reviews of LCA, they should probably know how to do that. They should know how to integrate all the scientific and engineering disciplines relevant to the LCA. They do not have to be specialists in that scientific or engineering discipline, but they have to know how to integrate that information into the LCA model. And they may need to know some environment, technical, and other relevant performance aspects of the hydrogen system. For experience, we're asking that the LCA specialist have similar requirements as you see in the clean fuel regulation, and that is they have actively participated in at least 2 life cycle assessments as an LCA practitioner that addresses the life cycle inventory in the area of either the greenhouse gas emissions inventory or the global warming impact category, and that these LCAs were ISO 14040 compliant. They should have carried out or participated in at least 1 LCA critical review as an internal expert, or alternatively 2 LCA critical reviews as an external expert within the last 10 years. They should also undergo the Fuel LCA model training or relevant experience. A process modeling specialist will be absolutely key for the validation team. The process modeling specialist must have the following experience. They have to have experience in applying established calculation and design methods to the model industrial processes. They have to have experience in producing mass and energy balances using simulation software, and that can be a variety of things from HYSYS to Aspen Plus to ProSim Plus. Determining and preparing process equipment specifications, and they should have experience in interpreting process flow diagrams and P&IDs. In some situations, the validation team will require a clean fuel regulation specialist. These are projects that propose to use eligible renewable hydrocarbons for the purpose of producing hydrogen. The CFR specialist should have a good understanding and use of the Fuel LCA model and current LCA practices. They should know how to use the CFR specifications for Fuel LCA model CI calculations. They should understand how the CFR carbon intensity is used in the Clean Hydrogen Investment Tax Credit Program, and likely the difference between the carbon intensity used in the clean fuel regulations and the Clean Hydrogen Investment Tax Credit, and CFR verification practices. The requirements for the validation reviewer is very similar to the team leader. And in actual practice, the validation reviewer tends to have more experience or training than the team leader. The only difference in the certifications knowledge and training is that the validation reviewer must have an understanding of the requirements of being a validation reviewer. The validation reviewer is a role that we get a lot of questions about, and what do they actually do in the validation? Well, they act as a second eye review on the validation. They examine things like the appropriateness of the team competencies, whether or not, for example, if a CFR specialist was required, whether they were on the team, or whether the process modeling specialist had the correct experience in the right industry. They'll look at whether the validation has been designed appropriately, from the risk assessment to the validation plan to the evidence gathering plan, making sure that those are all linked together and that they address the objectives, scope, and level of assurance designed for in the validation. They'll take a look at the evidence gathering activities to make sure that they are sufficient and appropriate, and they will assess whether all the necessary validation activities have been completed. And just a note there, it is not necessarily that they have completed all the validation activities, because midway during a validation, sometimes you will alter these activities based on the evidence that you have collected. It's whether or not all the validation activities that are needed to support the opinion that is being presented by the validation team is completed. The validation reviewer will also take a look at significant decisions made during the validation, whether or not sufficient and appropriate evidence was collected to support the conclusion and consequently the opinion. The validation reviewer will take a look at the validation team's decisions, whether or not evidence that is collected supports those decisions, whether any restatements made by the taxpayer made during the validation are adequately assessed, and any significant issues have been identified, resolved, and documented. As another note, it is not necessary that the information presented in the validation information package remain static during the validation. What generally tends to happen is, as the validation information package is reviewed by the validator, the information will be altered. When the information is altered, it is incumbent on the validator to ensure that there is sufficient and appropriate evidence to support that alteration. The validation reviewer will also take a look at the expected CI value, the validation information package, and the validation opinion to make sure that they all align and that there is sufficient and appropriate evidence to support them. They'll also take a look at the expected CI value and the validation information to ensure that it is presented in accordance with the criteria. Keep in mind at this stage in validation, the NRCan is looking for more of a disclosure approach rather than a material error approach. The team leader and validation reviewer will need to attend certain information sessions. The first of which is this one, the Clean Hydrogen Investment Tax Credit Validation Information Session. This session should be approximately 5 hours of online training with a self-assessment quiz and covers the basics of the Clean Hydrogen Investment Tax Credit Program. The second information session will occur on an annual basis as the program progresses. This session is called the Validation Information Session Update. It will be approximately 1 hour long. It will be online and will contain the validation observations and any program updates. Natural Resources Canada has a variety of methods of informing validators as to educational requirements, program requirements, and other updates to the program. Validators can get information from Natural Resources Canada in a variety of ways. One is an option of meeting with NRCan to address general clean hydrogen investment tax credit and project-specific questions. To qualify for this service, validators must satisfy the training and experience requirements, must be working with a client that has a clean hydrogen project that is being prepared for submission or in submission, and consent to NRCan publishing their question and NRCan's response on the Clean Hydrogen Investment Tax Credit website. We would keep all proprietary information confidential. This is really a method by which NRCan is promoting and informing other validators as to key questions and their corresponding answers. In prior slides, we have addressed the relationships between the taxpayer, the Natural Resources Canada, and the validator and verifier. Now we will delve a little bit more in detail by what we mean by independence and arm's length relationships. There must be an arm's length relationship between the taxpayer and the validator and verifier, and NRCan and the validator and verifier. These arm's length relationships are expressed by the relationship between individuals, and you can see the following reference for further information. In addition to validators and verifiers maintaining an arm's length relationship with the taxpayer, they must also establish independence. Independence is established by examining the threats to independence, which are self-interest, self-review, advocacy, familiarity, and intimidation or economic implications. A validator or verifier must be very aware that these threats do not exist when they are conducting the validation or verification, and if they do exist, appropriate mitigation measures have been put in place. Examples of threats to independence are shown on this slide. In particular, 3 threats: the self-interest threat, the self-review threat, and the familiarity threat. An example of a self-interest threat would be a validation team member's spouse sits on the board of directors of the taxpayer. A mitigation measure for this might be that the member of the board abstains from voting on any decisions involved with the validation. Another example would be the self-review threat that a validator might experience. For example, a person consults on the taxpayer's project and later takes a position with a qualified validation firm and is part of the validation team that is hired to validate the same project that they originally consulted on. A mitigation measure would be the qualified validation firm would ensure that this person is not part of the validation team period for the taxpayer's project until 5 years has passed. That would be an example of a mitigation measure. Another threat to independence might be familiarity, where the taxpayer invites the validation team to a sports game, for example, hockey or soccer or football. The validation team should, in this case, provide compensation for the tickets. That would be an example of a mitigation measure. The validator will be required to sign an attestation of independence form that will be applicable prior to the validation and during the validation. Essentially, this form ensures that the validator remains at an arm's length with the taxpayer, is independent of the taxpayer, and is not an employee of the taxpayer. If the validator has a threat to independence, they should notify the Minister of Natural Resources of the threat and what the mitigation measures are. If the Minister deems that adequate mitigation measures have been applied, the validation continues with the mitigation measures in place. If the mitigation measures are not adequate, the validation is halted. The taxpayer and the validator should have a contract that describes the validation. There are many items that go into that contract, but NRCan and CRA insist on 2 items. The first is that the validator will maintain records of the validation for a period of 15 years. This period may seem overly long, but it is designed to ensure that there is continuity between the validation and the verification, and there can be a significant time difference between project initiation and the compliance period. The second requirement in the contract is, in the event of an audit, the qualified validation firm will provide these records for review and will make themselves available for an interview. The validation information package is the key piece of information that the validator will be using to assess the project. They will be collecting additional information, but the validation information package includes some key information, and these 3 pieces are the front-end engineering design study or equivalent, the project's carbon intensity documents, and other validation documents. The validation information package is a key piece of information that the validator uses to conduct the validation. In that validation information package is the FEED study or equivalent. It is important to understand the intent of the documents that are included in the FEED study. So, for example, the validator will want to understand how things work and how they fit together. Documentation that helps with that are process flow diagrams, block flow diagrams, piping and instrument diagrams, utility flow diagrams, and electrical and control documentation. Energy and material balances allow the validator to understand whether or not the process or the project works from a thermodynamic point of view. There are equipment lists and itemized Class 3 capital cost assessments that allow the validator to understand what might qualify for the tax credit. And the Level 3 schedule tells the validator when the project might occur. Included in the validation information package are the documents associated with the project carbon intensity. This will include things such as the Clean Hydrogen Investment Tax Credit Workbook, the CI modeling guidance and supporting documents, and the Fuel LCA model export file. Other documents may include process modeling methodology document, preliminary documentation, and the monitoring plan. These are all essential documents for the validator to review. The last category in the validation information package is other documents. This will consist of the project KPI workbook, and in some cases, for example, for projects with ammonia, justification of the hydrogen production capacity and transportation feasibility. Preliminary documentation is an important concept in validation. Validation can occur at a variety of points in the project evolution, from early design to commissioning. Consequently, the validator must be prepared for documentation that is not necessarily confirmed or finalized at that point. So preliminary documentation refers to documentation that is required for validation but is not adequately addressed in the information package due to the timing. Examples of this could include power purchase agreements or the monitoring plan. The power purchase agreement may not be confirmed, it may not be legally binding, but the validator should look at the structure and whether or not it meets the requirements of the clean hydrogen project. A monitoring plan, for example, may be preliminary documentation because they may know what the measurement points are, what the parameters may look like, what the limits may be, but they may not have spec'd out the particular equipment. So preliminary documentation is information that will still require proof in the future, but at the point in time that the validator assesses the documentation, the information is not quite complete. So the validator assesses the reasonableness and the appropriateness of the proposed arrangements or information. And then in the validation report will disclose that these arrangements or information is preliminary and that it will need to be addressed in the later stages of the project. In the validation process, the planning stage is the second step in the process. Planning consists of ensuring that you have the correct team selected, collecting the correct information to do a desktop review, and developing the validation plan and evidence gathering activities. The team selection is usually conducted at the very beginning of the validation. However, validators should be aware that there is no penalty or requirement not to add team members as the validation progresses. Occasionally, team members are added just because there's a specialized subject matter that is encountered, or there are independence issues that arise, or perhaps there's even a resource constraint or opportunities. It's fine to change the team selection midway through a validation. However, any changes in the team composition should be documented in the working paper files and the reasons why these changes have occurred. The desktop review is a step in the planning stage that just ensures that the information in the validation information package is complete and accurate, or at least appears complete and accurate, and assesses the availability of any other preliminary documentation that the validator may need to assess the project. The validation purpose is multifold. Many of these purposes actually depend on one another or are interrelated with one another. The first purpose is to ensure that the Clean Hydrogen project is recognized by the Clean Hydrogen Investment Tax Credit Program. This, of course, is a purpose that, if not met, you might as well not proceed with the validation. The second purpose is to assess the reasonableness of the project design, and that's assessing the assumptions, the limits, the methods for designing the project, and also for calculating the expected CI, and just ensuring that they are reasonable. The third purpose behind the validation is to ensure that the CI calculation is correct and presented in a manner that it conforms with the validation criteria, meaning that it is correctly calculated the way the Clean Hydrogen Investment Tax Credit Program requires. The next purpose is to ensure that there is a sufficient and appropriate monitoring plan. This is important to establish at the validation stage to ensure adequate verification later on. And the last purpose, which only applies if there is clean ammonia tied to the clean hydrogen project, is to ensure that the clean ammonia side of the project satisfies the eligibility requirements. The validation plan and evidence gathering portion of the validation process is probably one of the most significant portions in the validation. This is where the validator will identify additional evidence to collect. It's important to understand that the validation information package is actually the assertion put forth by the taxpayer, and the validator should not feel confined or restricted by using just the information in the validation information package. There is an expectation that the validator will go beyond the information in the validation information package and pursue lines of query that are much further than the information provided there. Give you a couple of examples. A validator may choose to recalculate the energy and mass balances at a high level just to ensure that the calculations are done correctly. A validator may identify the limits of the model and compare that to the proposed operational conditions just to make sure that the two align. The collection of evidence is where the validator does the bulk of the work. They start generally with the evidence gathering activities that they've designed in the planning stage, but what happens during the evidence gathering is that these may be modified based on the evidence that is collected. What's important to understand is that in the collection of evidence, there's this spiral of evidence that occurs. The spiral of evidence is this process where the validator collects information, answers the question, and may have to collect additional information, but that additional information gets smaller and smaller until they spiral down into a conclusion. Once sufficient and appropriate evidence is collected and the validator has enough information to form a conclusion, the validator will assess whether there are any material misstatements in the validation information package or if there are any additional disclosures needed to understand the validation information package. What's important to understand here is the concept of materiality. And materiality has two components: a quantitative and a qualitative aspect. Validators tend to have to work with qualitative materiality more than quantitative materiality. Quantitative materiality refers to misstatements in the CI value, so they are numerical in nature or quantitative in nature. Examples that might change the CI value are things like calculation errors, incomplete inventories. For example, they'll omit a material source in the life cycle. They'll have unreasonable assumptions in the project design. Maybe there might be a misallocation of greenhouse gas emissions. We don't anticipate that the validator will run into quantitative materiality during the design phase of the project, but if you do, for the purposes of validation, the quantitative materiality threshold is equal to the aggregate cutoff criteria threshold, such as 2% of the CI value as defined in the CI modeling guidance. If there are errors, omissions, or misreporting in the CI value, NRCan requires that these errors are aggregated to determine what the total effect is on the CI value. The calculation that should be made for this is a % relative error calculation, which sums all the errors, omissions, and misreporting on the numerator side and divides it by the corrected CI value on the denominator side, multiplied by 100 to get it into percentage. Qualitative materiality is a more difficult concept to address in a validation than quantitative materiality. Qualitative issues tend to arise during the validation, and it's helpful to categorize what might arise in the validation. We've got 6 categories here that validators may take a look at. For example, eligibility. You may be looking at the eligibility of the clean hydrogen project. You may be looking at the eligibility of the feedstock, the PPA, maybe perhaps the ammonia facility. There's a variety of aspects. All of these are not quantitative in nature, but qualitative and require disclosure. Here's an example of assessing qualitative materiality in terms of eligibility. For example, if you have a hydrogen project, you want to make sure that the hydrogen project has a CI value that's less than or equal to 4, and that the pathway that the hydrogen project uses is either electrolysis or reforming or partial oxidation. For all projects, you want to make sure that the validation information package includes all the necessary components. And that means the feed study or equivalent, the project carbon intensity documents, and the other validation documents. For other hydrogen projects, you may want to take a look at the hydrocarbon that's used as input. Of course, this only applies to reforming or partial oxidation projects. In some cases, you'll have an ammonia facility that's attached to the hydrogen facility, and that must be looked at in terms of eligibility as well. And in other cases, you may find that there's a PPA that supports the hydrogen project, and the eligibility of the PPA must be assessed as well. So you can see how in qualitative materiality, you may have to take a look at various aspects of eligibility. Here's an example of looking at qualitative materiality from the perspective of representativeness. The design of the project is condensed into the validation information package, and the CI value is a representation of what's in the validation information package. The design, the validation information package, and the CI value are all linked together. And if you do not have the representation correct in either one of these steps, the chain is broken. Things can go wrong with the representativeness of the design. So for example, if the fuel LCA model setup does not reflect the design project, it is not going to be representative in the validation information package nor in the CI value. Another example of non-representativeness is if a power purchase agreement applies, a generic, not technology-specific power CI is used in the calculation of CI value. So the validator will need to assess the representativeness of the project in the validation information package and in the CI value. When assessing qualitative materiality, it is important to assess the reasonableness of the project itself. The question we get many times is, what is reasonable? So we have outlined a series of bullets here that give you an idea of what we think is reasonable. This is not a comprehensive list, but it is a list that will guide you in determining what is reasonable. So the first thing we look at is whether or not the clean hydrogen project provides the intended service or product, which in this case is hydrogen. We make sure that it doesn't violate any fundamental physical laws. It relies on a reasonable selection and application of the methods, assumptions, limitations, and data, and considers the complexity, subjectivity, and other risk factors. It includes equipment that is suitable for the intended application. It assumes efficiencies that are aligned with typical equipment in that service. It has operating parameters that are within the specifications of the process and the equipment. And it is designed to survive the anticipated life of the facilities. And that excludes your consumables, repairs, and replacements. So this is our definition of reasonable. Like I said, it is not comprehensive in nature, but it is comprehensive enough to give you an idea of what we mean by reasonable. What if? What if the uncertainty in the CI value makes it difficult to establish the specified percentage? And in the following example, we have an expected CI value of 1.8, but the uncertainty is 0.3. In this scenario, the specified percentage is likely 25%, but it could actually fall into 15%. So if the uncertainty changes the expected CI value by the specific percentage, meaning that it moves into a specific percentage category that's different, this uncertainty must be disclosed in the validation report, including the conditions under which it occurs. When assessing qualitative materiality, it is also important to assess the CI value calculation. Ensuring that the CI value is calculated to the criteria is a fundamental portion of the validation. The Fuel LCA model guidance consists of 4 distinct documents: the Clean Hydrogen Investment Tax Credit, the Carbon Intensity Modeling Guidance document, the workbook, the CFR specifications, and the data library and fuel pathways. In the Clean Hydrogen Investment Tax Credit program, the life cycle goes from cradle to gate rather than cradle to grave. What if? What if the Fuel LCA model does not represent the design? The taxpayer should make a best efforts basis to ensure that the Fuel LCA model does represent the design of the clean hydrogen project. But occasionally what might happen is that either there are assumed factors in the Fuel LCA model or guidance that makes the Fuel LCA model not represent the design. The validator should, in this case, ensure that the clean hydrogen project is quantified according to the Fuel LCA modeling guidance and using the factors in the Fuel LCA model, and disclose in the validation report that there are discrepancies between the Fuel LCA model and the design. Ensuring that the clean hydrogen project can be verified in the future is an important part of the validation. This is a qualitative assessment of the monitoring plan, and we understand that in many cases the clean hydrogen project may not have these details completely, but there are some components that will be available. And what we would like the validator to check are things like whether or not they have the correct measurements in place, whether or not they know what type of meter or measurement device goes in that location, the minimum design specifications, and the purpose of the measurement point, including where it might fit into in the Clean Hydrogen Investment Tax Credit workbook. The disclosure of adequate reporting is usually an issue of qualitative materiality. Disclosure in the validation information package is preferable. However, the validator may also disclose within the validation report as well. If there is a discrepancy between the validation information package and what's in the report, it indicates to NRCan that there is a disagreement between the taxpayer and validator, and that we will be looking at this fairly carefully going forward. Important to understand is that once disclosed, the matter is no longer material, and so you can issue a modified validation opinion. Examples of adequate reporting may be things like in ensuring that you've disclosed that there's high uncertainty around certain measurements or unproven technology. Maybe there's permitting difficulties or resource capacity challenges. These are the things that we would like to see in the validation information package and in the validation report. When developing the conclusions and opinion of the validation, there are 4 distinct forms, and this decision tree helps determine which of the forms of the opinion you can issue. The first question you should ask yourself, is there sufficient and appropriate evidence to come to a conclusion? If you can't, that is a disclaimer. Are there any misstatements? Leads you to an unmodified opinion if there are none. If there are misstatements but they are not material, they are modified. And then if you have material misstatements, they are adverse. The difference between an unmodified opinion and a modified opinion is that there are misstatements with the modified opinions, but they're not material. We anticipate that most opinions will be modified opinions just because of the nature of the information. Modified opinions are completely acceptable under the Clean Hydrogen Investment Tax Credits program. There's no negative connotation associated with them. We view modified opinions as a source of additional information rather than that there's a problem. 2 other forms of opinion are adverse and disclaim. An adverse opinion is issued when there are material misstatements in the validation information package, or the validation information package has not been prepared in accordance with the legislation and guidance. An adverse opinion must be provided if there are material quantitative or qualitative misstatements. Disclaiming is the issuance of opinion when you do not have enough information to arrive at a conclusion. We anticipate that these will be rarely used and that modified and unmodified will be the more prevalent forms of opinions issued under this program. The validation report consists of 2 very distinct sections. The first section is the validation statement. It is 1 to 3 pages in length and is meant to be an executive summary of the validation. Within the validation statement is the validation opinion, and it is a very prescribed set of statements as to what has been validated. The second section of the validation report is the additional information section. The additional information section is the largest section of the validation report. It does have some format associated with it, but it has a lot of latitude for the validator to describe different aspects of the validation. The validation statement is a subsection within the validation report. It is designed to be essentially an executive summary of the whole entire validation report. It is only meant to be 2 to 3 pages in length. It is a very prescribed format so that deviations can be easily identified from NRCan's perspective. There are 7 basic categories of information. One is just basic information about the hydrogen project. The second is the expected CI value from the hydrogen project. The third is the validation opinion, which is generally 1 statement. Fourth is the validation personnel and the process. 5 is key matters and matters of emphasis. So these are your top 10 types of things that you want us to take a look at. 6 is just a standard taxpayer and validator responsibilities in the validation, and then the last component is the validator and validator reviewer sign-off. The validation opinion is the crux of the validation statement in that it expresses the conclusion that the validator has come to in regards to the validation information package. It expresses whether the validator believes that the taxpayer claim is correct and whether they have followed the rules or have complied with the criteria in making that claim. To expedite the review process, that opinion is a prescribed wording. This slide is an example of an unmodified validation opinion. It has very prescriptive wording in it, and it requires the validator to attest to 5 distinct concepts. The first is whether or not the project is recognized as eligible under the Clean Hydrogen Investment Tax Credit. The second is whether or not the assumptions, limitations, and methods used in modeling and calculating the expected CI are reasonable. The third is whether or not the expected CI is properly prepared. That means, has it been calculated appropriately? The fourth is whether or not the monitoring plan will enable future verification. And the last bullet is whether or not the validation information package has been properly prepared and presented as we would hope it would be. This slide demonstrates a modified validation opinion. It is very similar to the unmodified opinion, with the exception in the first sentence that says the effects described below in the basis of modified opinion section of our report. So in other words, you are attesting that there are no material misstatements within the report, but there are some concerns, and these concerns are listed in the basis of modified opinion. When issuing a modified opinion, the validator will have disclosures. The content of these disclosures is to describe the nature and context of the misstatement and describe the impact. In the example below, we are looking at a situation where there's considerable operational range in a facility in which the output and the CI value will depend on local feedstock availability. And you can see in the possible contextual disclosure that there is a description of the nature and context of this situation, and it describes the impact on the CI value. In validation opinions, if you have a modified opinion, there must be a disclosure. There are two sections in the validation report where these disclosures must occur, plus a third in the additional information section. In the validation report, there is the key matters and matters of emphasis. And the difference between the two is that the key matters are the top items that may be of concern to NRCan. This is where we look to first when we are looking at a modified opinion. The second area, which is matters of emphasis, is really to provide context. So this is really about preliminary documentation that may not be ready at the stage of validation and may be ready later on in the project development. The additional information section of the validation report is an important part of the validation report. It is going to comprise most of the report in many situations. The additional information section includes both prescribed and discretionary information. Beyond the prescribed items, what and how to include in the additional information section is really up to the validator's discretion, but we will tell you at this point in time, more disclosure is preferred to less. The additional information section has four basic sections. The first is taxpayer information. The second is the validation firm information, but the third is the information respecting the validation. So stuff in the validation that doesn't appear in the upper sections of the validation report or require additional disclosure appear in this section. This will make up the majority of the additional information section. There is a fourth section, it's optional, but we would like to hear from you, is an optional assessment of the fuel LCA model. We recognize that we will see projects that may have some unusual technologies or methods to produce hydrogen that may not be reflected in the fuel LCA model. And this is your opportunity to express how the fuel LCA model may be modified to accept these new technologies, keeping in mind that you do have to use the data sets and calculation methodologies expressed in the CI modeling guidance. The validation reviewer fulfills an important role in the validation, which is one of ensuring that the validation was performed appropriately. This individual or individuals will review whether the validation was performed in accordance with the validation process, whether the team was appropriate, whether the validation process was appropriate. They'll take a look at significant decisions made during the validation. Any significant issues, for example, material omissions or misstatements that have been identified by the validator, they should be resolved and documented. They'll look at the appropriateness and sufficiency of the evidence to support the opinion, and also take a look at the validation statement and validation opinion. So these people are an important portion of the review process for the validation. Validation records must be stored for a minimum of 15 years. What validation records do is document whether or not there is plausible or sufficient and appropriate evidence to support the validation opinion. It will also document the validation reviewer's notes, records, and reports. A fundamental tenet about validation records is to examine them from the perspective of someone, a third party, coming in and taking a look at the validation records. And based on those validation records, would they come to the same conclusion that the validation team did and that the validation reviewer signed off on?